Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Come to order, please. Let's try that. Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. Thanks for coming today. If you would turn off your cell phones at this time, that would be most helpful. If you're not on our email list, but would like to be, there are papers on the far table there. You can put your email in that box, and we'll get you on the list. So next week, the Wheeling Poetry Series returns with Frank X. Walker. We're very excited to have him here. He is the first African-American writer to be named Kentucky Poet Laureate, and he's the founder of Pluck, Journal of Appalachian Arts and Culture, and he's a professor of English and African-American Studies at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. So Mark Harshman will be here, and he, of course, is the host and organizer. And a week after that, on the 18th, Steve Novotny and yours truly will present about local baseball, the history thereof, and some more modern stuff. So that'll be on the 18th at noon. We're very happy to have Brian Kammer here today. He is a Wheeling person. He grew up in the 70s and 80s here and attended Wheeling Country Day School and Lindsley School before leaving the state to attend college. He went on to become an attorney, defending death sentence prisoners in Georgia for over 2 decades. That work necessarily involved investigating the histories of class and racial inequality in his clients' home communities. Brian never lost touch with his hometown and retained a passionate interest in its history. In recent years, he has used the investigative skills he honed in his work as a capital defense lawyer in the Deep South to uncover and document the history of segregation and racial disenfranchisement in Wheeling, focusing on the effects of, as you can see, redlining and urban renewal. This is Brian Kammer.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank Sean and the Ohio County Public Library for having me. Sean and Laura Carroll and Aaron Rothenbuehler helped me assemble many of the documents I'm going to be talking about today, and kind of started me on this journey of trying to understand what happened in our city. I grew up here, as Sean said, in the 70s and 80s, and I was sort of vaguely aware that the city was not doing well. You could sort of tell it wasn't doing well just by walking around it. But I never really grasped what that was all about, and it's something that has always kind of nagged at me. And after the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, I learned about the history of redlining in an article by an author named Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I discovered that Wheeling was redlined, and there are maps generated by the federal government that show Wheeling color-coded based on race as to where investment risk as far as property and that sort of thing, and that was sort of shocking to me, and that started me on this exploration. And it's taken me some years to kind of put this together, but it's a history that I think helps explain the sort of long decline of Wheeling over the 20th century, and we need to understand it. And so we're going to be talking about the impact on the Black communities, especially in Wheeling, and I'm not going to purport to speak for those who lived through it. I think we need a separate forum to hear more from people who lived through that and who suffered from that. But what I want to do today is try and get some clarity about exactly what happened and where it happened and how it impacted all of us, not just the Black community, but all of us, because I think the entire city has been negatively impacted by this history. So let's get started. I titled this Broken Promises in part because I was listening to Darrell Clausel's presentation a few weeks ago, I believe. He focused on the Pythian building, on Chaplin, and a little bit of the history of East Wheeling. And he talked about the thriving community that was in East Wheeling. The Black community in East Wheeling had been there since right after the Civil War. Lincoln School was founded in 1866. Some of the oldest Black churches in West Virginia were founded here in Wheeling right after the Civil War. And he said, there was a thriving Black community in Wheeling, West Virginia, folks. It was wonderful. When you think of that thriving community, most of that history is not known. It's got lost. That history has scattered itself to a point where to try to collect it back is a process, because so many of our individuals who lived it have passed on. The city made a promise. They told those individuals, if you sell your land, we will rebuild everything as new apartments and houses for you coming off of Lincoln Homes. If you look at it today, there's nothing. That was the promise made, and that's why it's so important to bring back this history. We're talking here about the East Wheeling neighborhood. I didn't really know where East Wheeling was until I started really looking at the maps and really looking at old photographs, because I didn't know where Lincoln Homes was. I didn't really know where Grandview Manor was. I didn't know where, what are we talking about geographically? So I want to focus on really understanding the where of this as well. Here's a quote from Ann Thomas, who was interviewed by the Ohio County Public Library, talking about urban renewal in East Wheeling in the early 1970s. The whole African-American social fabric was there. People got displaced. The community has never been the same and will never be the same. I talked to Donna Terry, and she had a really powerful comment. She said, we had what the white community had in East Wheeling, but for us, we had established a good community, a small but strong community. It was like Black Wall Street. We took care of each other. We could withstand racism because there were positive things that reinforced against racism. Urban renewal was the annihilation of my community. We saw the bulldozers tear down our homes. When I think of the grief, heartache, and trauma that it brought to our lives, I cry. And I wanted to start with those comments because I want us to kind of confront the pain and trauma of what urban renewal did to these communities in the city. The fact that I didn't know anything about it is shameful to me. I learned nothing about this growing up. I lived over in the Oakmont, Pleasant Valley area on the other side of the hill. I really didn't know much of what was going on over here. So I'm starting off with a slide about the Kerner Commission. Urban renewal in East Wheeling happened right in the early part of the 1970s, starting in about 1971. And what was going on leading up to that? There was quite a bit of civil unrest in the 60s. The promise of the civil rights movement had kind of fizzled out. There was a huge backlash to the progress that had been made in terms of things like the Civil Rights Act, efforts towards desegregation in schools, and assassinations of important leaders like Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. There was, as we all I think know, there were uprisings in many cities. Lyndon Johnson commissioned this study of the causes of that. And the Kerner Commission came up with a report in February of 1968 saying, you know, white society has something to do with this. White institutions created these segregated enclaves. White institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. Now, the Kerner Commission report didn't really go into much detail about what all that meant. In fact, one of the major parts of the Kerner Commission report was to recommend beefing up the police and providing them the means to put down these rebellions. And so recently you all had a presentation about the incident in January of 1971 where Bobby Wade and George Lee were confronted by heavily armed police officers right at the Pythian building in Chaplin Street. I think about a dozen teenage kids were arrested, including Mr. Lee and Mr. Wade. And eventually all the charges were dropped, but it was an overreaction by police to a minor incident that had occurred. And this other photograph here of a heavily armed wheeling police officer is emblematic of, you know, the fact that after the solution to the conflicts that were happening in this country seemed to be more weaponry, more gear for police, and not really for addressing fundamentally what the problems were. What were the problems? After this incident, and I'm not going into it in depth because there was already a big presentation about it. I'm going to assume you all know about it. Bobby Wade was severely beaten by police, and he took his own life about a week after that incident in a terrible tragedy. The African American community in Wheeling asked for the West Virginia Human Rights Commission to investigate what was going on, and they held hearings in the city where members of the community were able to testify. Art McKenzie, the chief of police, testified. The fire marshal testified. Members of the city government testified. And the commission came up with a report that was, it found what I think was probably obvious to anyone who was looking carefully, that there's a new urban renewal project right around the corner in a neighborhood that's 99% black. And the cause of a lot of the tension and frustration and conflict between the black community and the police has something to do with the shortage of housing, the chronic shortage of housing in the city, the shortage of rental housing, and the fact that discrimination was rampant. Black people could not buy houses, they could not rent, and the urban renewal project barreling down the path was about to displace everyone, and yet there didn't seem to be meaningful provision for where people are going to live. That was one major finding of the commission. And you know, the commission recommended that everyone just try to get along, essentially. There were no concrete recommendations. The city was happy to have a report that did not recommend anything specific that it had to do. Let's take a look at the where of this. We're starting with East Wheeling. I'm going to talk about another wave of urban renewal that happened previously, but just looking at East Wheeling, this is an old aerial sort of drawing of East Wheeling, and if you can see up in the left-hand corner, Lincoln School is labeled and sort of prominently placed there. And that's the old Lincoln School building that was built in 1893. And if you look at the houses to the side there, that's the neighborhood we're talking about. That's High Street, Charles Street, Palo Alto, those, if you go up there now, it's quite different. We'll talk about that. Charles Street stretches up here in the middle of the picture. Anyway, there's a whole, as you can see, a densely populated area there. This is an old photograph, and it's kind of blurry, but the old Lincoln School building is on the far left. It's a little kind of a black smudge there. And then all across here, this is Chaplin Street East, the East Wheeling neighborhood we're talking about, that that got torn to the ground. I've tried to put some labels on here. The old Lincoln School, that's Chaplin. Charles Street, that should orient you. 12th Street would be, 11th and 12th are over here. This is a shot from the Public Library Archives. This is probably early 1960s. That's the new Lincoln School building. And then on the hill, anyone know what that is? Lincoln Homes. And then the East Wheeling neighborhood is this cluster of homes that you see kind of in the crook there. Getting a little closer, you can see this cluster even more clearly. Charles Street over there, Palo Alto and 10th, Chaplin, 11th. This is probably 1973. It's all gone. This over here on the left, that's Charles Street, High Street. It's all gone. It was razed to the ground. And the people that lived there were displaced. This on the left is an old Sanborn fire map showing that little triangular area. That's East Wheeling. You can see Lincoln School up in the left-hand corner. And you can see that, and this is from 1952, so the old Lincoln School building is still standing in this map, right down below Lincoln School. And then this is Chaplin, Oak Street. Charles, I guess, is that right there. And on the right is a modern day or present day satellite photo. Much of that is all gone, and it's all green space. And you can see these greenhouses. That's where Lincoln Homes was. I think I was propelled on this inquiry when I read an article about the urban gardening going on up on the hill, and they were talking about in the article finding little artifacts of the people that used to live there. And then something clicked for me. And I thought, what else don't I know, right? Some of you probably seen some of these pictures in earlier presentations about East Wheeling. Just to give you an idea of what was there. When Mr. Clausel and others talk about the thriving community, you've got your Elks Club in this picture. Next door to the Elks is a boarding house that is in the Green Book for 1943, I think. And you got the Macedonia AME Church there, all gone. The Elks Club, a huge part of the community, just of course as the church was. In this picture, we're just moving. This is Chaplin Street, just moving down, and you see the Pythian building. You know, the Pythian building, I wish I could have seen it in its heyday, because the Pythian Lodge, since the 19th century in Wheeling, had been such a central part of the Black community. This is a picture from High Street. You can see some folks sitting on the porch there. Does that look like a miserable slum? I don't think so. And these pictures weren't taken by a tourist or a member of the community. They were taken by a city employee who was stalking these homes in preparation to acquire them and destroy them. So imagine sitting on your porch while a guy comes around taking your picture. You know what he's there for. This is a shot of Charles Street, and you can see Lincoln Homes in the background. Lincoln Homes was built in 1958 in part to be able to receive the refugees from a prior wave of urban renewal in center Wheeling. And they stuck it up on this steep part of the hill where, it's not that easy to get to. And there were these steep flights of steps to get up there. But that's where that was. Now, this is today. That's Charles Street. That's just, you're looking in the opposite direction, but that is what's there now. It's just greenery. This is also Charles Street looking the other way. And if you see this big white house here, just beyond it is the Nelson Jordan Center. If we just quickly go back to the map here, it's the little blue dot on the map. That's the Nelson Jordan Center. I think at that point it might have another name, but the Nelson Jordan Center, another incredibly important institution. I talked to Marvelous Webb about the Nelson Jordan Center, and he described it as, it wasn't just a recreational facility. It was a place where people came to have meetings, community meetings. It was a place where you could have dances, you could swim. It was an incredibly important place for the community. There it is now. It's one of the only structures to survive urban renewal. And I think sadly it's just sort of in chronic disrepair at this point. Anyone know where that is? Can you see it? What does it look like? It looks like a densely populated neighborhood. That's 12th and Charles. That's right. Here it is today. There's nothing there. Go back. Yes. So, this neighborhood was up on a hill. The city didn't take great care of the streets. Some of the houses were run down. But this was still a vibrant and thriving community. This is a shot taken by my friend Rebecca Kiger. This is looking back up the hill on Charles Street. You can see on the right the stairway to nowhere. There's a lot of stairways to nowhere in Wheeling. That's because of urban renewal. Let me just zero in here. So how did this happen? What happened was the federal government passed housing laws in 1949 and 1954 that provided for what they termed slum clearance and urban renewal. Slum clearance became the big thing in American cities in the late 40s and 50s. Think about what was happening in American cities, especially in the North at this time. You had a massive migration of African Americans from the South to the North, and that had been going on in waves starting in the early part of the 20th century. And that was true for Wheeling too. Wheeling's African American population didn't get to become a much more than 3 to 5% of the city population. But you still had people coming from the south, and in other cities it was more pronounced. But I think there's a strong argument to be made that slum clearance and urban renewal, in a sense, were a reaction to that migration. Let me turn to let's talk a little bit more about, why was it so easy to call a section of our city a slum? The fact is that some of the housing stock wasn't doing too well downtown. That was true in a lot of American cities at the turn of the 20th century into the Depression era. A lot of the housing stock in American cities was getting old. And in the Depression, there was not a lot of ability to fix that. And so there was an effort to try and, through federal legislation, to try, there was a choice that could have been made there about fixing up the housing stock, or you could call it a slum and clear it out. And that's sort of what the direction that the federal government went. I need to switch to another, here we go. All right, let's talk about, so by the late 40s, early 50s, you get this emphasis on slum clearance, urban renewal. And one of the things that you find, I myself, when I thought about these issues, if I did, I thought, well, it was just sort of something that happened. It wasn't anything that could have been helped. It was just something that happened to cities. Cities just decay, and then they have to be, cleared out and done over. And the same for racial conflict. It's just something where people have to get over their prejudice. And so in some of these articles from Wheeling Paper back at that time, you get people saying stuff like, the very real problem is the combination of apathy and indifference. It's apathy and indifference that is causing our problems of poverty and racial inequality. And I think that was probably my thinking too growing up, that it was really about personal prejudice, people's attitudes that needed to be changed. This is another example, a liberal writer from the Intelligencer back in the 80s, Kathy Briley, who's writing to advocate that busing in order to integrate the schools should be stopped because it's causing too much commotion, basically. And she says, the problem is the problem of segregated schools is that the African American community just tends to be poor, and so they end up in the poorer parts of the city. And there's nothing we can really do about that. It just happens because of discrimination. People are prejudiced. We just have to wait for people not to be prejudiced anymore. And that's how segregation happened. And that's how inequality happened. It's just people's personal prejudices that we just hopefully have to wait for to go away. And I would say that was probably characteristic of the way I thought about it too for a long time. But then I learned about, I think, what was really going on. Let me get this into a better mode of display here. There we go. All right. Anyway, that's all nonsense. That's just all nonsense. The thing that you find if you delve into this history is that it was specific policies of the federal and local governments that basically exacerbated. It gave government power to private prejudice. It turned private prejudice into policy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that happened. You're looking at the the cover of the National Association of Real Estate Boards Code of Ethics from 1924. Oops, whoa. The Code of Ethics, this was a national code of ethics for realtors. A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. So if you're a realtor and you try to sell a house to a person of color, you can have your license revoked. So early in the 20th century, and again, these are reactions to the influx of African American migrants from the South. The real estate industry mobilized to contain African Americans to as small an area as possible within the various municipalities in which they were arriving. And they did so through this kind of thing. And they did so through a thing called racial exclusion covenants. What that is it's a clause in your property deed that says you can't sell it to a person who's black or a person who's not white. What you're looking at here is, what I'm trying to get at is the African American community in the downtown area of Wheeling was being contained. And here's one way it was done early on in the 20th century. So you're looking at the original plat of the Oakmont neighborhood over the hill here. Everyone know what I'm talking about? Holly Road, Forest Road, Oakmont, Rockledge. So this piece of property was bought by a handful of Wheeling's wealthy elites. Everyone know Otto Schenck, revered as the man who brought us Wheeling Park, right? Well, and he was a bigwig. He was the scion of the Schenck Meatpacking Company. He was the president of the Chamber of Commerce. He was on the board of directors of several banks in Wheeling. He was extremely, extremely wealthy. Through his efforts on the Chamber of Commerce, for example, all of the suburban areas like Edgewood and Oakmont and Elm Grove were all annexed into the city. And then in 1924, he and some other folks, including a guy named Charles Dowler, who's on the right here. Dowler, not as famous as Otto Schenck, but he was the city manager. And he was the head of the Wheeling Real Estate Board. So this guy knows about the ethics code, okay? And what they do is they buy up this huge chunk of property. By the way, they buy it from the estate of William Goshorn. It used to be part of William Goshorn's farm. William Goshorn, maybe you remember him from the story of Lucy Bagby, who was the last enslaved person to be returned to her owner under the Fugitive Slave Act right before the Civil War. Well, Mr. Goshorn was the person who purported to own Lucy Bagby. Anyway, that's where this piece of land came from. And if you look closely, you can't really see it, but you'll see that Otto Schenck's name is typed on several of these plots. Mr. Dowler's name is on several of these plots. Some of their relatives are named on some of these plots. What they did was they bought this thing together, and then they took ownership of multiple plots, and then they started selling them for a lot of money. You know what helps sell property? When it's next to a park, right? And it was that same year, of course, that Mr. Schenck was able to procure the land to create the park. Also, annexation is helpful because city services, sewer lines, gas lines, everything. Now you can put it all together, and you can start selling these plots in a fancy development. So they started selling these properties, and this is from one of the deeds from the what was called the Oakmont Improvement Company. That was the corporation that was formed to sell off these properties. And here's your exclusion clause. The party covenant not to sell, convey, lease, or otherwise transfer title or possession to said property to any but members of the Caucasian race. Okay. Basically, what that meant was the entire Oakmont neighborhood was off limits to black people. Then comes the National Housing Act of 1934 and the creation of the Federal Housing Administration. What the FHA was supposed to do around the time of the Depression was to jumpstart the housing market. It was to help people who were foreclosing on their mortgages, and it was to underwrite the new building of homes. The NAACP, and what this did was it kickstarted the suburbanization of America. And as this process began, the NAACP caught wind that black people were not getting any help from the FHA to purchase homes. And developers that wanted to build homes for African Americans were not getting any aid from the FHA. But the builders of segregated white developments were getting massive largesse from the federal government. And this is a letter basically to the FHA from the NAACP saying, hey, you're doing something shady here. But the problem was that the real estate industry basically populated the Federal Housing Administration. And they brought all of their racially discriminatory ways of doing business into the federal government. And so the FHA, which was a major New Deal piece of legislation, which saved America's housing market, saved the building industry. What it did was it jump-started the recovery, but what it did was it supercharged this the segregation of the country by underwriting developments for whites only. Now remember, the law of the land was still Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal. The equal part not really enforced. So the FHA underwriting manual, which was used by FHA agents to evaluate investment risk, was basically a manual for how to keep new developments white, essentially, and it was basically an exhortation never to provide any mortgage assistance to black potential home buyers, to limit assistance to white home buyers, and to underwrite only white housing developments. This is the power of the federal government being marshaled to now supercharge segregation. And Charles Abrams, who was a housing expert at the time, in 1955, said a government offering such bounty to builders and lenders could have required compliance with a non-discrimination policy. Instead, the FHA adopted a racial policy that could well have been called from the Nuremberg laws. In fact, Adolf Hitler admired American segregation policies. The FHA explicitly allowed local municipalities to segregate, if that was the custom. And they actually required realtors to use racial exclusion covenants to keep neighborhoods white, because the idea of as they called it, infiltration by black people or non-white elements. That was a recipe for undermining the housing market in those areas. Okay, so redlining, trying to go quickly. This is Wheeling, the redlining map for Wheeling. What these maps were generated by the federal government to give guidance about where banks should lend their money. And the red areas are red because, largely because of the presence of black people and foreign-born immigrants. My grandfather, my great-grandfather he was the child of German immigrants. He lived in North Wheeling in one of the red areas. But if you look at this map, the entirety of the city, or rather 70% of the city, is in the red or yellow areas. Oops. Okay. Here's the chart. Green, best. What does that mean? All white. B is still desirable, even though there might be a little bit of an element you don't want. The C is definitely declining. D, hazardous. Hazardous because of the presence of minorities and foreign-born immigrants. Other considerations were there, but these were primary considerations. So this is Oak Pond, okay, what we just talked about. It's green, it's all white. It's okay to lend people money to buy homes there. The yellow area, no, you don't want to do that. I grew up, or my parents bought a house right in the tip of that blue little peninsula there. That's near Wheeling Park, and it's a blue area because there were 5 black families that had moved in there by 1938 or whenever the map was created. So this is downtown. This is East Wheeling, right? You're looking north and south. And this is the area that we saw earlier that had been completely razed to the ground over here. That's all in the red zone. We know why. Now this is interesting because this is the commentary from the redlining map. The map had an annotation sheet, just sort of explaining why they were coding it the way it was. The population includes almost every type of old property and every type of population. So this commentary notes that there are nice houses here, but there's a black section, and it stretches from 12th Street along Market and Chaplain out to about 7th. It's about the most spotted area in the city. It was a diverse area. That's why it was coded red. So it wasn't necessarily that the properties had to be dilapidated or falling down. The problem was it was diverse. There were black people there. Just to move as quickly as I can. The federal government subsidized white suburbanization through the FHA by subsidizing the mortgages, made it easier to pay them off, lengthened the time you had to pay it off. White people benefited. By the 50s, 60s, you're talking about 80, 90% of mortgage assistance was going to white people moving to the suburbs. Elm Terrace, a prime example.
That's where I live.
That's
my
where,
neighborhood.
is that right?
Yes, sir.
Well, at that time, it was an all-white neighborhood, and it had to be an all-white neighborhood, or it wouldn't have gotten federal backing, which this entire neighborhood got federal backing. Here's the pamphlet for the homes you could buy in that neighborhood. They were eligible for FHA and VA insured mortgage loans. That made it cheaper to buy these homes. It made it easier to pay them off. Black people could not buy into these neighborhoods until probably into at least the late 60s. Because even after the Supreme Court outlawed racial covenants in 1948, the FHA resisted any effort to to stop the practice of segregation, of government-backed segregation. They still believe, the FHA administration still adhered to the Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal type model. They were just not going to read anything into the Supreme Court's decision about racial exclusion covenants. And so even into the 60s, if a development indicated it was going to sell to black people, the federal government would not support it. Okay, let's go back quickly. All right, so slums. So basically what redlining did, this is a newspaper article from 1956. Federal officials came to Wheeling to talk about slums. They said, the slum problem is because there's not enough mortgage money coming into the city because there's not enough competition amongst the banks. Why not? Because of redlining. Because of redlining. That's why there's not enough mortgage money coming into the city. So what's happening to our city? It's starting to fall apart. There's decreasing levels of investment. People are not buying homes. They're not able to fix up their homes. Black people could not get loans to fix up their home or their business or buy a new home or build a new home. And anyone who wanted to build a home or buy a home or fix up a home in this redlined area or in the redlined areas was going to have a very hard time doing so because of redlining. That's what redlining does. And you're talking about decades of redlining, right? Redlining is in effect for decades. And what is happening to Wheeling? It's losing population. The downtown, we've all seen it. We all saw it happen. We just didn't know about the redlining. But redlining made it easy to declare huge swaths of the city blighted. Okay? This is the first major urban renewal project, Center Wheeling, from 23rd to 27th, from Market down to Maine, in that middle section. There's a map. There's the Sanborn map. Here's an aerial shot. Lots of housing. Now this area was very, very. What's fascinating about this? It's fascinating and it's tragic. These communities were diverse. This community was not solidly black, but there were many black people in this community, but there were many other ethnic groups in this community. Lebanese, Syrians, Polish, Ukrainian, Italian. Everybody was there. Was everybody living in harmony? Not necessarily, but they weren't segregated. Okay? So what's happening with, so what is urban renewal doing here? What are we seeing here? We're seeing that through the destruction of these communities, you're causing segregation to increase in the city. This is, I was going to show you a video, but it's too logistically difficult. But my friend Mike David, whom some of you may know, he's from a Lebanese family who settled here in Wheeling. They lived in this area that was demolished. And back in the 40s, his parents got married at the Our Lady of Lebanon Church, and they had a party outside their house at 2334 Main Street. And they fortunately took these beautiful home movies, and you can see that there are African American people who are their friends hanging out. We're all hanging out together, celebrating this wedding. It's an amazing scene, and it's just emblematic of the community there. But again, redlined. This is 1950s census data for the area where Mike lived, and you can see. I don't know if you can see this clearly, but this is NEG stands for what you think it stands for. That the census data shows you the race of the people living in this block. So it's diverse. Here again, they've crossed out COL and written NEG, okay? Everyone else, W for white. And you can see here, interestingly, Greek immigrants classed as white. But black people are always NEG. And you'll note that some of the black people coming from places like South Carolina, Alabama, people were coming up from the South. This is part of the Great Migration. Look at this. It's hard to see it from where you're sitting, but these are census data from that neighborhood. People from Lebanon, Austria, Poland, all white. Greek, Turkish immigrants, they're classified as white. Syrians and Greeks classified as white. Isn't that fascinating? That's a story about how white people assimilate to become American, white European ethnic groups. That privilege of assimilation denied, in essence, to black people. And it's right there in the census data. This is showing the demographics of the displacement caused by urban renewal in Center Wheeling. Many of you probably know that area was torn down. They built a post office there. It was supposed to attract loads of new businesses. And I think I was just talking to my new friend about how wonderful Center Wheeling was in terms of the variety of small businesses, you know, and the atmosphere of community that was there. And the people of the community vigorously fought back against urban renewal. They protested it. They said, why don't you just help us rehabilitate the properties? Why do we have to tear it all down? And in fact, the people of Wheeling twice voted down in referenda the funding to conduct the urban renewal. Then, when the city just couldn't get their own people to comply, the downtown business associates decided to raise their sales taxes in order to finance urban renewal, and that's how it happened. The downtown business associates, and I'm going to come back to that, they wanted urban renewal, and they got it. Just looking again at more census data real quick. I know it's boring seemingly, but what you're looking at here is the census data for, you can see young Ann Thomas in this. If you look really carefully, her family was the Augerbright family. You'll just notice that they are sandwiched in between two white families. So East Wheeling, at that time in 1950, was also it was a mixed community. It was more heavily African American, but there were other people, other ethnic groups living there. These communities were diverse. What I'm trying to say, they were not rigidly segregated, but urban renewal and redlining was causing segregation to increase. Okay, let's get back to 1970, 71, and what happened to East Wheeling. What happened was the Fort Henry Mall project. Most of the time, even I heard about the Fort Henry Mall project growing up. I heard, oh, we lost out on the mall, and the Ohio Valley Mall destroyed the city. You know what? The city was being destroyed long before the Ohio Valley Mall came along. The Ohio Valley Mall could destroy Wheeling because Wheeling was tearing itself up. This development was supposed to build a mall downtown. It would have major national franchises and some of the local businesses like Kaufman's, Kohl's. What are some others? You know, they were going to be offered space in the new mall. Okay, yeah. Stone and Thomas was definitely going. But okay, so if you notice, so you see the downtown central business district at the bottom, and that area up top is the East Wheeling neighborhood, right? Charles Street, High Street, Palo Alto, Chaplin. They called it the Chaplin Street East Project, also known as the Fort Henry Mall Project. I'm going to get this full screen. So basically, the city declared these entire swaths of downtown to be blight. So you're the downtown. You're one of these downtown businesses. The same people who wanted center wheeling to be torn down, now they're being declared blight. Okay. In addition, East Wheeling is being declared blight. The whole thing's being declared blight. And that was what the power, that's what the federal legislation gave the power, that's the power the federal law gave to the city. And the agency that was doing this was the Urban Renewal Authority. I want to talk about them. So this is just showing you the way it's going to turn into the Fort Henry Mall. This is what the mall is going to look like. It's going to be super fancy, fantastic and futuristic with all kinds of. You know what? It could have been. We'll never know. We'll never know, right? This is, this is East Wheeling, gonna kind of become a wonderful oasis of garden apartments. This is what was promised to the residents of East Wheeling. Fantastic new garden apartments to replace your old house or your old apartment. You're all going to be able to come back, is what they told folks. This is a rendering of what it's going to look like after it's developed. Multi-unit apartments, townhomes, going to be great. You're all going to be able to come back after we tear it down and build it back up again. And then there's going to be the mall, too. Isn't that going to be great? Now, they did actually build the high-rise that says high-rise for elderly. They did build a high-rise for the elderly, the Booker T. Washington high-rise. I'm not saying they wouldn't have built all this stuff ultimately, but what happened, of course, and this is from some of the propaganda that the Urban Renewal Authority put out. The law required at least some semblance of consultation with the community. You can see Clyde Thomas down in the lower right-hand corner. Clyde Thomas was a city councilman. I don't think at this time he was, but he was very active in interfacing with the Urban Renewal Authority about this project, and he was trying his best to make sure that the interests of the community were being heard and respected and taken seriously. He supported this project. Many in the community, I think, supported the project in principle because it could potentially bring jobs. It could bring new housing. All those things were promised. This is more from the propaganda put out by the Urban Renewal Authority. They had to sort of show that they were engaging the community. They created youth programs, job assistance, job training, recreation stuff. I think, again, if you look at this picture, you think propaganda. But that's not to say that there was some effort. Okay. But there was a lot of anxiety in the community, and as we know, there was this conflict and tension that was going on, and the Human Rights Commission tried to deal with it. So the contrast between the rosy predictions of the Urban Renewal Authority and the anxiety in the community is kind of emblematic, illustrated by this newspaper headline. You've got the news about the Human Rights Commission, which is supposedly going to figure out solutions to the racial tension in the city. But down here on the left, we're tearing it all down, by the way. That doesn't seem too helpful. And when you think about it, there's nothing the Human Rights Commission is going to be able to do about all this about to happen. Here is 1020 Oak Street. Here's the guy coming along on Oak Street, holding up things and taking pictures because he's going to tear down your house. And this picture, I have gotten permission from the family of these folks to use to show these pictures. They show, I think, a lot of pain you can see. That is, there's a woman on the porch, and she's kind of covering her face because the guy is taking the picture, I'm sure without asking permission, obviously. That is Lenora Hunter. She was a nurse at OVMC, a close friend of Ann Thomas. And I believe that's Emmanuel Hunter, her husband. And I don't know if you could see it from there, but there are 4 little children in the window peering out. They're going to lose their home. Marvelous Webb is who I spoke to about this. This is his sister, who has passed away years ago. He talked about how his family came from Alabama to escape racial terror. They came to Wheeling to try and make a better life. And this is where it's headed. Emmanuel and Lenora Hunter thought they owned their home because they had what they called a land contract. Black people could not get mortgages that we're all kind of familiar with today. Some of them could, but most of them could not. So what they would get often were these things called land contracts. It's like rent to own a house. You pay your mortgage payment, but you don't gain any equity. If you miss a payment, you're foreclosed on, right? You have no equity. And so what happened was they were deemed not to have title to the house by the Urban Renewal Authority. The guy who they were paying every month was this guy who lived in a single-room occupancy hotel, the Wheeling Hotel. They gave that guy $4,000 for the house. That's about $40,000 in today's money. That's a lot of money that Lenora and Emmanuel Hunter couldn't get. So you just keep in mind, you can't buy a house in Oakmont. You can't buy a house in Elm Terrace, and you can't you can't even buy a house in your own neighborhood. So how are you able to accumulate wealth? Okay, so then demolition. The neighborhood is torn down. And this is what Donna Terry is talking about when she says we saw our homes torn down. This was very traumatic for the community. I didn't know anything about it. Meanwhile, the downtown businesses have mobilized people to vote down the project. They not only mobilized people to vote down the project, they wanted them to abolish the Urban Renewal Authority altogether. So, on the one hand, the Urban Renewal Authority is tearing down people's homes, causing a lot of dislocation, and there's reason to dislike that. But what's been happening? They have promised they're going to rebuild the neighborhood. They're going to build the mall. There's a reason why the people in the East Wheeling community don't want the Urban Renewal Authority to be abolished, because how else is the community going to get rebuilt? But the Downtown Business Associates had a huge propaganda machine going on. This is a bumper sticker. On the eve of so what they did was they petitioned for a referendum in the city. The city was going to vote on this. When we talk about the African American community in Wheeling, we're talking about 5% of the population. They're too small. They're too few, right? Their anxiety, their peril is not being taken seriously. So this is a letter from the Project Action Committee chair for the East Wheeling part of the project. And she is writing a letter to the editor of the Intelligencer saying, to the community, let's not forget these sacrifices which we were forced to make, and which we accepted, I might add, were for the betterment of the entire Wheeling community, just as the Fort Henry Mall will benefit the entire Wheeling community. Don't stop the Urban Renewal Authority. Don't let a few selfish businessmen make you change the rules in the middle of the game. We want the new community and the new housing, which was promised to us. You can't allow these people to take away the benefits many of us are receiving after the sacrifices we've had to make. You can't stop now. You owe it to Wheeling. You owe it to us who have been asked to make the sacrifices, and you owe it to yourselves. So let there be no mistake. The city and its people were on notice. She wasn't the only person opposed to this in the community, but I think this letter is very powerful. What did the city do? It voted to shut the whole thing down. But what had already happened? The entire neighborhood had been razed to the ground. And so we see the overgrown, areas over here where there's nothing, just stairways to nowhere. What happened to the people? Well, you heard it from Daryl Clausell and Donna Terry and Ann Thomas. They were scattered. The community was wounded grievously. That's bad enough. I looked at I was able to get the Urban Renewal Authority application for federal funding, which they submitted in January 1971. Right during all of this tension, right during the demolition phase. They had to do that every year to keep the funding going, right? In this thick application, it is revealed that the goal really is not about rehousing the African Americans who were displaced by demolition. The goal is to basically disperse the community, to reduce the concentration of minority housing. What this says basically is they'll be absorbed in the community at large. The city has in the past experienced reduction of minority concentrations, center Wheeling, and through continued efforts by the relocation staff will continue to do so. I read that as we're going to disperse the Black community and let them find wherever it is they're going to go. Wherever, Is there going to be a serious effort at relocation? I don't think so. Here's what else they're going to do. They're going to rehouse the families that are going to be displaced by construction of State Route 2 to this new neighborhood that's going to be built. Who are the people going to be displaced by State Route 2? The white folks up the way. This is something that happened quite frequently in urban renewal projects all across the country. It's called space swapping. That's where they would move African American communities out and move white people in. And that's what apparently the intention was. The city county planning commission affirmed that in a letter to the federal government that was included in the application. Alan Dietrich Ward, who wrote a book called Beyond Rust about the Wheeling area, confirmed in an interview with Frank Joe Now, the former director of the Urban Renewal Authority, that was in fact a major goal of the project, was to provide housing for the dislocated caused by Route 2. That's not what was told to the community, was it? I think that's pretty awful. So I'm getting to the end here. I read this book called Root Shock, and it's about the impact of urban renewal. And it's by this author named Mindy Fullilove. And she writes, and I think it gets at the aftermath that I think we all need to be cognizant of. Root shock at the level of the individual is a profound emotional upheaval that destroys the working model of the world that had existed in the individual's head. Root shock undermines trust, increases anxiety about letting loved ones out of one's sight, destabilizes relationships, destroys social, emotional, and financial resources, and increases the risk for every kind of stress-related disease from depression to heart attack. And that I think is what you're seeing in some of the pained words that I started this talk with. Root shock ruptures bonds, disperses people to all the directions of the compass. Even if they manage to regroup, they're not sure what to do with one another. The elegance of the neighborhood, each person in his social and geographic slot is destroyed. I know a little something about that. My grandmother, who grew up in Wheeling, she said that she would tell me when she was very old. She would tell me that she would dream about going home because she didn't live in a part of she had moved from her home in one part of Wheeling to where she lived in Beach Glen in the 40s. But as she got older, she would dream about her childhood home. And she would dream that she would go to her childhood home in North Wheeling, and it would all be rubble. And she would wake up crying about it. And I thought, well, that's just a dream. It's a sad dream, but it's just a dream. But it was true, because that's her childhood home on Kenny Street, where my great-grandfather lived. It's all rubble. And that kind of, I could feel that that pain and sadness of losing one's home. But here's the difference for my grandmother. Here's my great-grandfather and great-grandmother in that house on Kenny Street. And on the right is my grandmother in her home down here in the green zone. My grandfather, great-grandfather, and where my grandmother grew up, in the red zone. A lot of foreign-born immigrants. Now, by a stroke of good fortune, because her aunt had some money and loved her a lot, she was able to purchase a home in Beach Glen, in the green zone. That was the thing that kind of brought me to where I am today. She was able to raise 5 kids, send 4 of them to college, one of whom was my dad. My dad was able to buy a home in another part of the, that community there. My parents were able to send me to college. And the reason, so that the consolation prize for white European ethnics who had to leave their homes was that they could move anywhere they wanted to if they had the means, and they could accumulate the wealth and assets to make sure that their families would be prosperous through the generations. Okay? And that is why it's what some commentators have called the cash value of whiteness. And here's the proof. These are if you go into the county building, you will find these cards showing how much the homes in Oakmont have been sold for over the years. Remember, this is the neighborhood that was all off limits to black people. Look at this. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of value accumulating for these homes in the green zone. Who's getting them? White people. Homes were deeded by will to children, right? That's free money right there. The point here is, it's sad that my grandmother had these sad dreams about her rubbleized childhood home, but there's a consolation prize, and that's that my family was able to accumulate wealth and assets so that we could have nice lives. African Americans in Wheeling were literally contained by government policy, headed by, of course, private prejudice, such that they could not get out of their those borders. And so that's, and I think the redlining and urban renewal for our city is, it caused the decline, I think, my argument is it caused this decline that we've all lived through. That's why the city's been struggling for 100 years, why we're just now maybe starting a little bit to climb back. And are we doing so equitably? Are we? I don't know. I hope so. But I want to repeat the past, right? That's what history is for, so we don't repeat it. Because the history of Wheeling is not enough democracy, racial discrimination, and we all, at some level, we all pay the price for that because we watch our city suffer. And I would also argue that the destruction of Wheeling's Black and integrated neighborhoods, it tore the heart out of Wheeling, not just the Black community, but Wheeling. I think these communities were the conscience of our city. They were the cosmopolitan heart of the city. They were always working racial reconciliation. If you know about the history of the Blue Triangle, YWCA, places like that, those folks were trying for decades to get Wheeling, to get over its self-risk. So I know, but that's my story.
I know you did a comment. Thank you for doing what you did. Teachers all this well. Good one. If you look at the demographics of population in the United States, percentage of persons of color, West Virginia has the lowest number of percentage of persons of color, no acceptance, no welcome, no opportunity. So we need to look hard at ourselves and when we say we're not racist, we're welcome.
Thank you.
You touched on several markets. We call the South Low. The first 9 years of my life I lived in, there was a neighborhood that had grocery stores, gasoline stations, everything. We talked about how the sports, but I think that my first 9 years in the South Low, I remember being in this place for the store. They moved us out, and I'm one of the ones who got to see that story. Also, I moved to 12th and Jacob, where the family home used to be next to Central General. So to see, it's very sad to see two neighborhoods. When you show those pictures, to me, that doesn't show the neighborhood I grew up in.
Yeah, I didn't have any good pictures.
Even one, because I see it as a community that grew up with me, that took care of your family network. And like I said, you have businesses in the center market or South and Southwest, candy store, all kinds of different businesses stuff up there. Talk about family. Well, that was like,
Yeah.
we were one of the fortunate ones to be able to buy a home in the center market. So we were able to buy the home on 12th and Jacob. But I see where a lot of people lost that wealth.
Yes.
Moved from one to the other. And then the promise of what they did with Lincoln Home was right over the hill, if I'm not mistaken, where we was there,
Yes.
were only whites.
Originally, that is correct. Only whites could live in Grandview Manor, and then only in the 60s did that start to change. And Lincoln Homes was deliberately sited in East Wheeling to house Black people. But then eventually it became integrated. But think about this. Lincoln Homes gone. Grandview Manor gone. Those places weren't the greatest in great shape, but they were also places where people had families. There's a lot of pain over the loss of those places too, and loss of the Lincoln School. Lincoln School, which had wonderful teachers. The school, it produced incredibly talented students and was a gem of the community. Gone right after Brown came out. Clay School, gone. Elks Playground, gone.
When you talk about broken promises, the human rights investigation, I was the young lady in the picture, they promised them that they didn't even one, they were gonna take care of Nelson Jordan Center. They did nothing, absolutely. You know, that was one of the recommendations. When you talk about broken promises, it's all over the map for us.
Well, the Tim Kogan, is that his name? Tim Kogan, the lawyer, he was the director of the Human Rights Commission after urban renewal. He did tried to enforce the equal opportunity laws. You know, he would respond to. He was trying to redress the employment discrimination issues. The city fired him for that because businesses didn't want him to comply.
When you talk about the planning commission, it's been a thing that all the commissions or committees that are making decisions in this city are all white. There's
Yes.
nobody of color. So when they wrote that letter to the planning commission, we probably wasn't nobody of color on there. So we could be repeating history again for those making decisions for everyone, and everyone's not included.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, probably the most important point here is generational wealth development, which is impacting people today.
Right.
People who own their home or had a home back then, if the bank would have invested into their homes and things, they could have used the money to invest in businesses, invest in college education.
Yes.
Plus, we had that concentration of people in that area. A dollar circulated a number of times in that area. And that is the real issue. This is generational wealth. But today we do have a new urban renewal called gentrification that's actually happening in Willing right now, where people are buying up older houses in the city of Willing, in the East Willing, and fixing them up, investing hundreds of thousands of dollars into these homes, raising the tax rate for that area, and forcing people who live there to move out or can't pay their tax.
Yeah.
And that is a real issue that's happening right now. Is the new urban renewal is called gentrification, where banks will lend people money to a lot of money to fix up these older houses, but I don't know a person of color will go to that same bank. Will they be able to get a loan or not? Because I've experienced that in my lifetime. We're working on the same job as my white counterpart, where they can get the money from a bank. Work for it to me, I ain't good for it. But yet still, the banks are willing to give them money. The banks are willing to give a person back then, say $6,000-7,000 for a car, but not willing to give anybody money for a home.
This was something I heard from other folks I talk to constantly. I can get a loan for a car, but not for a house. A common issue apparently. The other thing I forgot to mention is steering. The way the real estate industry steered people away from buying homes in places like steered African American people away from buying homes in places like Elm Terrace. Clyde Thomas and Ann Thomas wanted to live in Elm Terrace. They were steered away, for example. Other folks I spoke to were steered away from Elm Terrace and other neighborhoods. William Brooks, another person I talked to, wanted to buy a house in Elm Terrace and other neighborhoods in Wheeling. Couldn't get anyone to give him a loan. So he moved to St. Clairsville. He said, "Hey, I just wanted to buy a house and have a family."
Was that you buy a home for like $30,000, the tax assessment wants to come in, and the tax assessment is telling you that even though you have $1,000 business money, that they're gonna assess it at like $200,000. All of a that in, your taxes are $7,000 a year.
I don't know anything about that.
But I'm just saying, but the interesting thing to me is the difference with what you houses. Taxes here are more expensive than taxes in California.
No, I don't know anything about
It's
that.
very interesting what happens in the town.
Well, if gentrification is an issue, you know, one of the things that needs to be considered is some kind of ordinance or law that allows longtime residents not to have to pay the higher taxes. That's what we do in my town of Decatur, Georgia. There's and I don't know how effective it is, but basically, if you've lived there for a long, long time in your home, there are elderly people, for example, who've lived in their homes for forever. There's a law that allows them not to have to pay the full assessment, or it keeps it set at a lower. So those things need to be considered if gentrification is an issue in the city. I suspect we're. Go ahead.
Those three houses are put up, they're open to the public and we have back to the public. I'm not gonna say what organization
I think it's great. I mean, I love a garden. I'm just saying, you know, it used to be people's home. So we should remember. Thank you.
I'm gonna say thank you.